Hi there. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Shanna Moore, and I'm the Training Supervisor with the FASD Network of Saskatchewan. My job here at the network is I travel all around Saskatchewan and outside of Saskatchewan and delivering training and presentations on FASD. A little bit more about myself. I'm pretty passionate about what I get to do is I don't just work in the field of FASD. I also live FASD. My 11-year-old daughter has FASD, so throughout the presentation, you may hear me talk about stories from my personal life, and I share that just to kind of make it a little bit more relevant to maybe some of the stuff we might be seeing. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the FASD network before we go ahead and get started, because lots of people haven't heard of our organization or are unsure of what we do. So with the training program that we have here, we can offer all kinds of different training. We can offer these community presentations, which are about an hour, hour and a half in length. We can go into post-secondary classrooms across Saskatchewan and deliver free presentations on FASD into any post-secondary classroom. We are mandated by the government to deliver 3 hours of foster parent training to all foster parents in Saskatchewan. So we deliver 3 hours of FASD training to foster parents, as well as we have 6 hours of intensive frontline training that we offer as well. So if you're interested in taking more training or organizing training for your organization, you can connect with me and I can give you all the information about that. And then, like I said, we can go into communities and do community presentations as well. We also have a support program, so it doesn't matter where you are in the province of Saskatchewan. We are a provincial organization, so if you're looking for support, so if you're working with a client that might potentially be impacted by FASD or working with a caregiver that's raising a child with FASD, they're more than welcome to connect with our services. I always say the big takeaway to our support program is that you do not need a diagnosis to use our services. We do not require that because so many times in the world of FASD, people don't have the diagnosis, and it's free, so you don't need to pay to access a support worker. And I always say we are harm reduction, person-centered, so we're going to meet people where they're at. We're never going to come in and tell someone that this is what they need to do. Our support workers are going to say, what do you need help with? And let us help you get there. And how can we help you get there? And also we have one worker who specializes in the justice field. So if you have any people that you're supporting that are in the justice system, victim or offender, we have a justice worker that can help navigate that, navigate the justice system. We also have a worker who works intensively with individuals who have some type of connection with Child and Family Services or the Ministry of Social Services. Perhaps they're at risk of their children being apprehended or their kids have been apprehended and there's FASD in some shape or form in the family. Then we can provide more intense services for those families to have to ensure that those families stay together. But I believe all of our contact information and stuff is at the end. We are located in Saskatoon, but as I mentioned before, we are a provincial organization. We do have a support worker that is located in Regina now and always consistently putting in proposals to the government to get workers more dispersed across the province. So we'll go ahead and get started. So I always like to start a little bit with statistics because statistics show how prevalent FASD is in our communities right now. Right now that they estimate that 4% of the Canadian population is impacted by FASD. In Saskatchewan, they estimate it's roughly 5%, and that 5% of the population, that's roughly 55,000 individuals in our province alone they believe could potentially be impacted by FASD. That statistic is not based on diagnosed FASD because FASD often goes undiagnosed, misdiagnosed. You get every diagnosis in the book before you get the FASD diagnosis. The statistic that is based on diagnosed FASD is they say 9 in every 1,000 live births is impacted by FASD. And like I said, that's quite an underestimate and it's quite a dated statistic. And we don't actually have any current stats on how many people in Saskatchewan are actually being diagnosed with FASD at this point. But even when we say that 4% of the Canadian population is impacted by FASD, that actually puts the rates of FASD higher than the rates of autism and higher than the rates of Down syndrome. And yet we continue to be the most significantly underfunded disability in Canada. So we're constantly fighting for supports and funding to make sure people with FASD are supported to the best that they can be supported. And so when why, and I guess they're talking about why is the estimate so high at 4 to 5%. Another statistic I like to use is that 50% of pregnancies in Canada are unplanned. I've heard them say it could be as high as 61% of pregnancies in Canada are unplanned, and 80% of the population drinks. So we hear this expression that FASD is 100% preventable, and technically if no alcohol is used during pregnancy, it is preventable, but when we have so many pregnancies that are unplanned and a high population of people that drink, we're never ever going to prevent FASD 100%. And so definitely moving away from that wording because it's highly stigmatized wording, and we're trying to shift the conversation in FASD. We're going to skip this video because I don't think it worked last time. So one of the things I always talk about, FASD, kind of going back to that, like shifting the perception and challenging people to think differently. FASD has a lot of negative stigma attached, a lot of negative misconceptions. It's a very shame and blame focused disability. And we're definitely trying to get away from that. We're trying to challenge people to think differently. So kind of I always like to tell people when you learn about FASD, you need to go back to your communities, your place of employment, and challenge people to think differently. Especially when it comes to moms who have kids that are impacted by FASD. If you have a child with FASD, it doesn't make you a bad parent. As I mentioned, there's a lot of unplanned pregnancies. How many times have we heard I quit drinking when I found out I was pregnant? I'm sure everyone listening to this webinar knows someone or perhaps themselves that have had an unplanned pregnancy, right? And the research shows that there's no safe amount of alcohol during pregnancy. They can't pinpoint if there's a safe amount or a safe time, so the messaging there is no safe amount or safe time. Research does show it can be as little as 2 binge drinking episodes for a child to be impacted by FASD. And when they can talk about a binge drink, they're following this Canadian Safe Drinking Guidelines, where a binge drink is considered 4 or more drinks on one occasion. Right, which is often a huge misconception because people think a binge drink is, a 2-day bender or whatnot, and it's not. So it can be pretty minimal amounts of alcohol to have a baby that's impacted by FASD. And so I always say what we need is safe, more compassionate, understanding communities for moms to be able to come forward and say, yeah, I did consume alcohol during pregnancy, and not to be worried about the outcome of that. Women often fear that their kids will be apprehended, that they'll be taken away, that the stigma that's going to be attached to them. And so it's hard to make, to come forward and say that. And so as I mentioned, we need compassion, we need understanding, and we need to break down the reasons why alcohol is used during pregnancy, and we need to take the shame and blame out of the conversation. And so we talked about unplanned pregnancies, but there's so many other reasons why women may consume alcohol during pregnancy. We have women who are dealing with addictions. Perhaps they're in unsupportive or abusive relationships. And honestly, who knows the minute they're pregnant? I've met some people who said they knew the minute they were pregnant, and I'm going to say majority of people don't, okay? And so like I said, you have an unplanned pregnancy, you find out maybe when you're 4 months along, and those binge drinking episodes could have happened. And unfortunately, we still have people in the medical field that are telling pregnant women it's okay to consume alcohol during pregnancy. They'll say, yeah, it's okay, it's safe to have a glass of wine, or it's okay to have a beer, and but they're not going into conversations about how big that glass is, how often they can have that glass, right? And so we got to make sure that the right information is going out there, and that it's had with all women, right? FASD impacts all of us. FASD doesn't discriminate. It doesn't matter what your skin color is or what your background is. We should have conversations about alcohol use in pregnancy with every woman. We have women that are dealing with mental health issues or trauma. And I always say in Saskatchewan, kind of how well are we doing with providing the right supports and services to everyone that's dealing with mental health issues and trauma? I can say I don't think we're doing an overly fantastic job. There's so many systematic flaws and lack of funding and whatnot. And so when we have people that are dealing with mental health issues or trauma and they don't have access to the right supports and services, quite often they're self-medicating to deal with everything, right? So that can be another reason. Or they could be living with FASD themselves. And if they're living with FASD themselves, they might not actually understand the connection. They might not understand that when they consume alcohol, they could potentially be harming their unborn baby. What I can tell you with 100% certainty is that no mom drinks on purpose to harm their baby. So every mom wants to have a healthy, happy baby. And I can't stress enough that we just need safer, more compassionate communities for moms to be able to come forward and say, yeah, I did consume alcohol. Right, and maybe even shifting the question, instead of asking if you're working with a mom and you need that information and saying, did you drink any alcohol during your pregnancy, could potentially be a really triggering question, could be a really tough question. Instead, we could shift it to saying, was a pregnancy planned? How was your health before you found out you were pregnant? Did you attend any parties? Did you attend any social gatherings? Just kind of shifting it to a softer way to talk about it. And like I said, just taking that shame and blame focus out of it is going to move us in the right direction. So what is FASD? FASD is a disability that's caused by alcohol use during pregnancy. What happens is that alcohol passes freely between mom and baby, and it can cause all kinds of damage to the baby's brain, central nervous system, spinal cord, their whole physical body. One of the things that's changed in the world of FASD is they often referred to, in the past, the wording was used that FASD was just a brain-based disability, and that is 100% not true. And the new language that they're using is FASD is a full body disorder. So in 2015, here in Canada, we changed the diagnostic guidelines around FASD, and the terminology got changed. So we're going to go over what that looks like. The goals in changing the guidelines was they wanted to make it more consistent everywhere you went in Canada to get the diagnosis, and the same criteria needed to be met to get the different diagnoses. So as you can see, sorry, the one kind of messed up, but we have FASD with sentinel-facial findings, FASD without sentinel-facial findings, and we have an at-risk designation. So what do these look like and what do they mean? The first thing I want to stress is that FASD is an incredibly complex disability. There's no two people with FASD are going to be impacted the same, and that's why, like I said, it's incredibly complex. The expression I like to use is when you've met one person with FASD, you've met one person with FASD. You could be supporting two people with FASD, and one person's deficits could be the other person's strengths and vice versa. So FASD with the sentinel facial findings. So what does this look like? So a huge step in the right direction that they did for this diagnosis, if you have the three facial characteristics of FASD, which I'll get into in a moment, that can be used as the confirmation. So you wouldn't need the confirmation for mom to get that diagnosis because the facial features can be that confirmation. And then they test 10 different brain domains. And out of those 10 different brain domains, 3 brain domains, you have to be impacted quite significantly. So under the third percentile in at least 3 brain domains. So if you're working with someone who's impacted by FASD, I can't stress enough is that if you get access to the assessment, what you want to look for is the brain domains of impairment. Is it their memory that's been impaired? Is it their processing, et cetera, and that's where you get really unique in the strategies we put in place. They could be impacted in more than 3 brain domains, but you just need 3 of those brain domains to actually get the diagnosis. And then FASD without the sentinel facial findings. For this one, we need the confirmation in some shape or form. I also want to stress it's going to be dependent upon the diagnostic doctor, how they take that confirmation. So we can't really speak much to that and just say it's dependent upon the doctor, how they take it. This one, there's no facial features. It's 100% invisible. And then once again, the brain domains of impairment. Another thing, another stat is they believe that 90% of people with FASD actually don't have any facial characteristics. Okay, so for most people living with FASD, it is 100% invisible. So when you've heard FASD is referred to as the invisible disability, that's why. And then this at-risk designation is for when someone goes in for the diagnosis and for some reason they don't feel comfortable giving the full diagnosis. So maybe they're not old enough, maybe they're 5, and right now they're not diagnosing FASD in kids, probably till they're 8, 9, 10 years old. They have all the 3 facial features. There's some concern, but just at the time they go in for the assessment and diagnosis, they just don't feel comfortable giving them the full diagnosis. So this was created so people don't fall through the cracks of the system. So if you go in and you get this at-risk designation, what it means is first and the most importantly is that it means you should get the same supports and services as someone who has a full FASD diagnosis, and then you should be reassessed again in 2 years. So it was kind of created to help people from falling through the cracks of the system. So they're followed up with the assessment happens again because as the individual ages, the impairments become more noticeable, and that's why they wait till they're a little bit older. I guess the biggest thing that I want to stress, right, it's a really, as I mentioned, it's a complex disability. So there's not one diagnosis up here that means you're impacted more severely than the next. And this has always been a huge misconception in the world of FASD. Lots of people believe if you have the facial features that it means you're impacted more severely than someone who doesn't have the facial features, and I can tell you that's 100% not true. The facial features just help with that confirmation piece. So why do some people have them and some people don't, and what are those facial features? So the three facial features that they're looking for is your philtrum, the groove underneath your nose could be completely flat, a very thin upper lip, and the eyes. They measure from the inside to the outside of the eyes, and they can be smaller. I want to stress that it is only doctors who have been trained in FASD that can make these diagnoses. They'll take a ruler to your face, they're going to measure, they're going to look for those three specific facial features. And then why do some people have them and some people don't? Because they can pinpoint in pregnancy when the facial characteristics are forming. So if no alcohol is consumed on those days, you won't have the facial characteristics of FASD. So your philtrum, the philtrum and the lip form in baby from day 19 to day 21 of pregnancy, and the eyes in the baby form from day 32 to day 35. So if no alcohol is consumed on those days, you're not going to have the facial characteristics of FASD. So in the past, there's been always this misconception that if you have the three facial features of FASD and it means you're impacted more severely and whatnot, I can tell you that's 100% not true. It just depends at what time the alcohol was used, how healthy was mom, how mom metabolizes alcohol, et cetera, et cetera. So if you, like I said, I can't stress enough, if you get access to someone's diagnosis or assessment, where you want to look is the brain domains of impairment, and that's where you're going to get unique in the strategies you put in place. The former diagnoses that have been used for many, many years, and there's lots of people still with these diagnoses, was FAS, partial FAS, and alcohol-related neurodevelopmental disorder. And like I said, the people were getting more so, I think, caught up in the terminology. If someone had partial FAS, they would assume that they didn't need to be supported. As someone who had full FAS could say they're only partially impacted, which was 100% not true. It just was dependent. It was the diagnostic terminology they used. And so like I said, please don't get hung up in the diagnostic term. Once again, you want to go back to those brain domains of impairment. And when we talk about FASD, we talk about primary disabilities and secondary challenges. So primary disabilities are the disabilities that are a direct result of the prenatal exposure to alcohol. We classify them in 4 categories: physical, cognitive, behavioral, and sensory. What we're going to do now is just going to give you a brief overview of how FASD might present. So maybe you don't know you're working with someone who potentially could have FASD, and maybe some of these things might sound familiar and might make sense for some of the patients or clients you work with. So as I mentioned, physical disabilities, right? Talking about FASD, it's not just a brain-based disability. It can impact your whole physical body. There's a whole bunch of physical things that can happen. Some things that we see, though, is some delayed motor development. We often see this in infants and toddlers, right? They're slower to meet those developmental milestones. Problems with fine and gross motor control. Often we see this when kids are like starting school and stuff, and maybe they struggle to hold their pencil. They're not keeping up with their peers. Poor balance. This is an individual that's maybe really, really clumsy, right? You know, maybe at school the kid's falling out of their desk. Maybe it's an adult who seems intoxicated who actually isn't intoxicated. It's just that their balance has been impacted by their FASD. Lower height or weight. It can happen. This actually used to be part of the requirement for the diagnosis. It no longer is because they found that not everyone with FASD is more petite, but in some cases it is. I know with my daughter, she's her height is fine, but we have a really hard time getting her to gain weight. Auditory impairments, how much do they hear? How do they process what they hear? So for example, if you're working with a small child and, they only hear the last word of everything you're saying and you're telling them, don't run, and they hear run, and then they run, and then you said, hey, I told you don't run, and then they hear run again, and then they run, and then the child's given a consequence for something they don't understand in the first place. Okay, and then then we may have a behavior, a child acting out because they're frustrated for something they didn't understand. Then we can have poorly developed body systems. So there's lots of different things that can happen. Maybe there's digestive issues, heart issues. They're starting to potentially think that maybe there's a link between early onset dementia and FASD, early onset menopause. There's a whole bunch of physical things that can happen, heart murmurs, etc. So if you're supporting someone with FASD and they say they have FASD, and you're, especially even if you're in the medical field, right, start looking at all the physical things that can happen, not just the cognitive, but the physical pieces as well, because they might have been, born into bodies and that they don't know should feel any different because that's the way they were born. That's how they felt their entire lives. So just be super, super aware of all the physical things that could happen. Then we get into cognitive disabilities. So how I like to explain cognitive disabilities is often stuff that doesn't come easy to us, or stuff that comes easy to us often doesn't come easy to people with FASD. I want to stress, though, people with FASD can be highly successful. So everything I talk about, there's a support and strategy we can put in place to make them successful, okay? And there's nothing that they, can't do, but they do have some challenges along the way. So people with FASD can have short-term or long-term memory deficits. That's when it's there one day and it's not the next, and then it's back again. This is often seen as intentional, purposeful behavior. Maybe they're missing doctor's appointments. Maybe they're missing appointments with their addictions counselor, whatever it is, and then it's seen as they're not invested. They can't be bothered to come to the doctor, when perhaps there could actually be like something concretely wrong, which is, memory deficits. Confabulation is the art of storytelling. So maybe we're working with a client or a patient that's telling some big story. We probably have a good gist that it's not true. But what happens in the world of FASD when they're telling you something that happened and they forget part of their story going back to that memory deficit, maybe they start telling a story that happened they saw on TV or their friend's story, they remember that story, and they start pulling that out, and they remember that as it happening to them. So their memories are getting mixed up. Out comes this big story. It's often mistaken for lying, like they just lie. It's an attention-seeking behavior. It is absolutely not. It's confabulation, and it's the art of storytelling. It's just how it's getting pulled out of their memory is incorrect. And like I said, out comes a big story that we know actually didn't happen. A slower processing speed. An expression that's being used to describe kids with FASD is by a lady of the name of Diane Melvin, and she referred to them as 10-second kids in a 1-second world. Okay, it takes them 10 seconds, maybe 20 seconds, maybe 30 seconds, maybe 40 seconds, maybe 50 seconds longer to process information than the other person. And that's okay, right? This goes into adulthood as well. You don't outgrow this piece. And so making sure if we're working with someone with FASD, definitely don't be talking as fast as I'm talking right now. We have to really slow it down, making sure they understand, and we have to give them the time they need to process the information. It may be perceived as they're not paying attention, they don't care, they're not even looking at you, but really in reality they could actually just be processing everything that's going on or the conversation and trying to make sense of it. A shorter attention span, impaired executive functioning, that's the ability to self-organize, get to places on time. Maybe they're coming to appointments, but they forget all their paperwork, etc. Difficulty setting and reaching goals, problems generalizing. This is a really big one. Individuals with FASD don't always have the capacity to take what they've learned in one environment and transfer it to another. So often it's a teaching of the same skill in new environments all the time. So maybe you're in an appointment with a client or a patient who has FASD and you're explaining something, you think they have it, and then they go home and it's gone, right? Because now when they go home, it's in a different environment. And so we might need someone to come in and teach them in their new environment, because when they're working with you in your clinical setting or whatever setting you're in, and then they go home, it's a concrete, like it's a different location. I apologize, I don't think I mentioned as we go through like the physical, cognitive, behavioral, and sensory, is that not every individual with FASD is going to have every single thing that I talk about, okay? Every individual, like I said, there's no two people who are the same, so not every individual is going to have every single thing that I talk about. But just be super cautious of the problems generalizing, right? The ability to take what they've learned in one environment and transfer it to another. Problems connecting cause and effect. Lots of individuals with FASD don't understand their actions have consequences. This is where we see a lot of people in the justice system with FASD, because they don't understand the connection between their action, right? So they might repeat the same thing over and over and over and over again. Poor receptive language skills. This is something to be super, super aware of. People with FASD can present really well, have really fantastic conversations. How much they understand is a whole different story. So I can't stress enough to constantly check how much they understand. So if you're having a conversation with someone with FASD and you think they understand, and you say, what did we just talk about? And they repeat back word for word what you just said to them, I'm going to tell you they probably don't have it. Okay? Or if they give you, yeah, I understand, they probably don't have it. So a huge thing that you can do is just tell me what we just talked about, but in your own words. And ensuring them that it's okay if they don't understand, they can say, right? It's really, really important. And then that can cause lots of issues if they're saying they understand when they don't. And then trouble with abstract concepts. People with FASD can struggle with things like time, money, and math. Stuff that's really, really abstract can be really quite hard. Quite often they're very concrete thinkers. Okay, everything's at face value, so just be aware of that. Be aware of the language you're using, right? Don't use abstract language either. Sarcasm, they might not understand that because, like I said, everything's kind of at face value. That concrete thinking happens. And sometimes they can have a lower IQ, but I can tell you quite often, more than often than not, this usually isn't the case. Usually their IQ is just fine. Where this causes trouble, though, is when we're looking for supports and services, and when supports and services are based on IQ, which we do have some that are. If their IQ is fine, but they struggle in all these other everyday tasks, it might be hard to get services in place for someone with FASD. And then we got behavioral disabilities. The one thing I want to stress so importantly is that behavior is a sense of communication. And often when we can try to figure out what they're trying to communicate, we can often prevent that behavior. So as you can see, one word up here, it's called dysmaturity. I always say this is, if there's one word you take away from FASD information, take this word away, dysmaturity. Dysmaturity is when someone's developmental level and physical age don't match up. Okay, and so in the world of FASD, they probably never will match up. In some cases, they do say it can be safe to assume that some people's developmental level can be half of their physical age. So can you imagine if you're working with someone who's 20 years old and their developmental level is that of a 10-year-old, but you have 20-year-old expectations. Okay, so always making sure your expectations are to their developmental level, and everyone's is going to be different. So you just kind of got to try and figure out where developmentally they are and put yourself, have those expectations for that developmental age and not their physical age. And then we can have problems with social skills too as well, right? So when we have people that are physically one age, developmentally younger than their physical age, social skills can be hard. They can have trouble maintaining healthy friendships. They can struggle with social cues like body language. Maybe you have someone who talks really, really close to you, makes you uncomfortable because you understand personal space. Someone with FASD might not pick up on that. Impulsivity is huge in the world of FASD. Mood swings, their moods can kind of be all over the place. Sometimes lack of inhibitions. This is like stranger danger, what's that? Maybe we have adults with FASD. They go out, they buy everyone a drink because everyone's there to see them. And then we have perseveration. This is when their brains fixate on stuff, so maybe they hyper-focus on stuff. And so this time often can seem like super wearing, or, they've just asked me the same question 100 times over, or I've told you this 100 times already. I can tell you perseveration is part of the disability. They're actually not fixating on stuff to irritate you or annoy you. It's just that their brains are stuck and they're having a hard time getting unstuck. They can react poorly to changes in routine. Routine and structure is so incredibly important to people with FASD. They need that routine and structure to have the good behaviors and to help with memory deficits and all those different pieces. But when something in that routine changes, they can have a hard time, and so sometimes we can see a behavior, because for someone with FASD, if something in the routine changes, it's not just like a 10 or 15-minute change, it's now their whole routine that changed, and now it's a whole routine they have to learn all over again. For people that don't have that, right, 15 minutes of our day change, we can be pretty flexible and go with it, but like I said, for them, it's not just that 15 or 20 minutes or hour that's changed. It's now their whole day that's changed. It's their whole routine. Poor understanding of ownership. This is often mistaken for stealing, so this really goes into that concrete abstract thinking. So people with FASD might take stuff that doesn't belong to them because they might not actually understand if nobody's around something, right, it might not belong to someone. So an example, maybe you're in your office, you have your phone sitting on your desk, a cell phone, but you're not by your cell phone. A person with FASD might actually pick up that phone because if nobody's around it, it doesn't belong to anyone, it's kind of fair game. Like I said, it's often mistaken for stealing. It's not actually stealing when they don't understand that piece. Hard time regulating emotions. Vulnerable to peer pressure, right? Easily influenced. That goes back to that dysmaturity piece. Maybe you're working with a 16-year-old girl with FASD who's hanging out with 16, 17, 18-year-old boys. Is there a chance she might become sexually active before she's ready? Absolutely, because if she's 16 with FASD, maybe she functions at an 11-year-old level, whatever it is, but can be easily influenced and vulnerable to peer pressure and can become easily overwhelmed, and we'll get into that with the sensory pieces and unrealistic expectations. Then we get into sensory disabilities. Sensory disabilities, I believe, are the root cause of lots of different behaviors that we might see. Sometimes it can be the hardest thing to figure out, but the simplest thing to fix. So people with FASD can be oversensitive, undersensitive, or hypersensitive, or hyposensitive in all these different categories. So taste, maybe their food has to taste a certain way. Maybe they need a lot of spice in their food. Maybe they can't handle a lot of spice in their food. Smell. Some people with FASD might have a really heightened sense of smell, or they might have a hard time smelling. Touch. Maybe some people with FASD like to be touched. Maybe some people don't like to be touched. Maybe their clothes have to feel a certain way, right? Maybe they can't handle seams in their socks or tags in their shirts, or, with my daughter, blue jeans. She cannot handle blue jeans as much as she wants to wear them. She just can't stand how they feel on her. She also craves a lot of touch, so things like a weighted blanket's really beneficial for her. So it's kind of like, figuring out how they interpret the world. Hearing, they could have a really heightened sense of hearing or a hard time hearing. So you can imagine being in the hospital with a heightened sense of hearing and a heightened sense of smell and sensitive to touch, and maybe they're in a hospital bed and the hospital sheets, how they feel, and then all the different smells in the hospital, and then the hearing, right, everything beeping. Maybe someone's getting super agitated in that environment. Sight, rooms that are really calm are better, like not a lot on the walls are better than stuff that has lots of stuff on the walls because they could be visually distracted. Their proprioception could be impacted. This is where your body is in relation to your surroundings. So quite often, like in younger people with FASD, maybe they like to be in tight, confined spaces because they feel safe and secure. In adults, we see them, they like the really heavy blankets when they sleep, or they like the sheets pulled really tight. Your vestibular input can be impacted. This is your movement sensations. So you could be sensory seeking, so that person that's constantly moving, or sensory avoidance, right? And so maybe even being in a car might make you car sick. Three big ones that aren't on there I always say to be super aware of is hunger sensation. So some people with FASD, they never feel hungry, so unless they had reminders and prompts, they might not eat. Or it could be the opposite. They eat and eat and eat because they don't have that sensation of feeling full. Temperature is another big one. People with FASD don't always interpret temperature the same way we do, so perhaps they can be outside when it's really, really cold, like minus 40, in a t-shirt and flip-flops, and not realize that that's not appropriate clothing to be wearing because they don't feel the cold like we do, right? With my daughter, I know one of the struggles we've had lots this summer is when it's been really, really hot, and for her to understand that she needs to take her hoodie off and not be wearing long pants, right, dressing for the heat versus the cold. And so we have to have lots of reminders about that. And then another big piece of the puzzle, and I can't stress this enough, is pain. So when you have people with FASD, maybe it's like they get a paper cut and they have to go to the hospital and get stitches because they're super sensitive. They think it's just, right, that's all they can feel. Or it could be the opposite, where they're walking on a broken ankle and don't know that it's broken. So I always say if you're supporting someone with FASD who doesn't feel pain, just be super, super cautious that they could be really hurt or quite sick and not know it, okay? My daughter is an individual that doesn't experience pain the same way as everyone else, so she has a really high pain threshold. So I know anytime we've had to go to the doctor or whatnot, I say on a scale of 1 to 10, if she can't physically see it, we're pushing a 15. If she's saying something hurts, we're at a 15 before we even get there, right? Just because her body doesn't interpret it. She could walk on a broken ankle and not know it's broken. So just be super cautious if you're supporting someone with FASD who doesn't feel pain. And then we get into the secondary challenges. These aren't a direct result of the prenatal exposure to alcohol. They say they can be prevented, but quite often they're not, just because of how FASD can be highly misunderstood. And when we get misunderstood, then we can see lots of secondary things happen. Mental health issues. Statistics show that people with FASD, 90% of people with FASD will have mental health issues at some point in their life. Addictions, there is research that suggests that people with FASD actually get a stronger sensation from the use of drugs and alcohol than someone who doesn't have FASD, and then that addiction can come on really strong and be hard to kick, especially when we're not modifying addiction treatment programs to accommodate people with FASD. Justice issues, they can be the victim or the offender. There is lots of steps happening in the right direction with the justice issues, with the mental health courts that are happening. You know, I know in Manitoba they have an FASD-specific court that's running, so definitely little pockets of positive movement in that area. Education and employment. I would say if you have nobody advocating for you within the education system, I would say this is probably the #1 secondary challenge for children and youth with FASD. They're often just so highly misunderstood. They're the bad kids. They're lazy. They're not motivated, all those different things. And if you don't get the support and help you need, you're probably not going to keep going to school. Employment, can people with FASD be employed? Absolutely, 100% they can. Sometimes it's just as simple as a place of employment, understanding that person has a disability and learning how their brain works. Housing and homelessness, well, if you struggle with abstract concepts and you struggle with money management, maybe you have housing, maybe you're forgetting to pay your rent, maybe you have no money to pay your rent, etc., without some support and help, and then you can end up homeless. Relationship and friendship issues, that kind of goes back to that dysmaturity piece. Sexuality, healthy sexuality, and parenting with FASD. And I always say, can parents with FASD be parents? Absolutely, 100%. We just might need some support and help along the way. But I also like to stress there's not one person in this world that can go through life without support, right? I need support, you need support. So people with FASD, when they need support, their support just looks a little bit different, and that's okay. Now I say people with FASD 100% can learn. We can set people with FASD up for success, but the people that have to do the most learning are the people that are supporting people with FASD. So it's this whole shift that kind of happens when we start to understand their disability, how their brains and bodies have been impacted. This whole shift happens, and now we don't see them as annoying. They're probably frustrated and challenged. Are they lazy, or are they tired of failing all the time? Are they a liar? No, it's called confabulation. They're filling in the blanks. Are they fussy, or they have that sensory piece going on? Are they acting younger? Guess what? They are younger. It's called dysmaturity. Are they attention seeker? No, they need that contact support. Are they inappropriate? Or once again, just that dysmaturity piece and displaying behaviors of a younger child. So as I mentioned, people with FASD 100% can learn, but the people that need, like I can't stress enough, that need to do the most learning are the people that are supporting people with FASD. And always just making sure we're using the right language when we're talking about someone with FASD or disabilities in general, and just always that we refer to someone with FASD or they have FASD, never like I have an FASD client or I have an FASD patient. It would be I have a patient with FASD or I have a client with FASD. Lots of people don't use person-first language, and it's really, really powerful, and we need to start identifying people as by their names and who they are and not something about them. And so this is bringing us to the end. So at the FASD Network, this is a lot of information in a really short amount of time, but if you're interested in more training or more information, we have all kinds of resources. You can find them on our website. Every one of our resources is printable in PDF. We do events and conferences and workshops all throughout the year. We have our toll-free. You can call us Monday to Friday, 9 to 4. And you can refer any clients or patients or people that you're supporting who potentially could have FASD, or as I mentioned, caring for people who have FASD. I kind of talked about our support program already. We do case management, peer support, employment services strategies, justice system, referrals to community programs, and lots more. And then we also can set up, so if you are supporting any individuals with FASD who perhaps would benefit from a mentor, we can kind of take the lead on that, and we can apply for funding through the Cognitive Disability Strategy, also known as CDS, and maybe to help get funding for a mentor in place. And mentors kind of can help individuals with FASD with those everyday tasks, maybe it's such as grocery shopping or money management that they need, and we can get that put in place for them. And that brings us to the end. So like I said, we're on Facebook. We have a website. We're on all these different social media platforms. If you'd like to connect with me, as I mentioned, my name is Shana Moore, and I'm the training supervisor at the FASD Network. My email address is just training@fasdnetwork.ca. Check us out on our website, and please don't ever hesitate to call us if you have a question or you're looking for more information, because that's what we're here for. Thank you.